I'm truly sorry for this. I never intended for it to turn out like this. Is this true? I asked my sister, trying to understand. This isn't the right time for that, she replied, avoiding my gaze. Saffron, you have to put her first, I said firmly. It was clear I was getting upset. I found myself raising my hand toward both of them in anger, a side of me I had never seen. I had never been so cold-hearted. I never wanted to experience something like this ever again. But because of my foolish husband and my sister, I was left with memories that would haunt me forever. Memories they would never be allowed to forget. They would never see the light of day. That day, I had promised to pick up my niece, Saffron, from preschool. My sister had once again insisted that I take care of her. Can you pick Saffron up again tomorrow? She asked. Why are you always so desperate? I replied, frustrated. You're a stay-at-home mom. You have plenty of time. That's not the point, she snapped. Through the phone, I could hear Saffron coughing in the background. Is Saffron sick? I asked, concerned. No, she's fine. Don't worry about it, my sister responded quickly. She just coughed for a second. Anyway, can you do me this favor? Keep her for a bit longer. How long are we talking? I asked. A week. I'm going abroad, she said, sounding unbothered. A week? Are you serious? I can't do that. Well, I'm leaving Saffron at the preschool. If no one picks her up, she'll just stay there, my sister said, her voice cold. You're unbelievable, I muttered, reluctantly agreeing. I didn't want my niece to suffer because of her careless mother. But not long after, I got a call from the preschool, much earlier than I was supposed to pick Saffron up. They had tried calling my sister countless times with no answer. As her emergency contact, they reached out to me. They told me that Saffron, who had been running a slight fever, had lost consciousness and was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. I dropped everything and raced to the hospital, but by the time I got there, it was too late. I had been married for 6 years, and despite trying to start a family, we hadn't had any children. My sister, on the other hand, had a baby 2 years ago, but she and her husband divorced soon after. Since then, she had constantly pushed Saffron onto me, insisting that it would be good practice for when I had my own child one day. I had mixed feelings about it. On one hand, I was annoyed at being treated like a babysitter. But on the other hand, I adored my niece. Saffron was sweet and innocent, and I couldn't bring myself to say no to her. I even told my husband that I'd take care of Saffron again the following day. Can you help me out tomorrow? I asked my husband. I'll be looking after Saffron again. I wish I could, he replied. But I've got an urgent work situation to handle. I have to leave early tomorrow for a business trip. Really? Are you sure you can't postpone it? I've known the client for a long time. It won't affect the deal, but I'm responsible for sales, so I have to be there in person. Okay, I said, feeling the weight of the responsibility on my shoulders. Just be careful. I'll manage on my own. If it gets too much, I'll go to my parents. You'll be fine, he said with a reassuring smile. Thanks. I'll call you when I land. At the time, I thought I was just unlucky. My niece was always so attached to my husband. When I had looked after her before, she would cry through the night, and I struggled to calm her down. But my husband, he had a way with her. He would scoop her up in his arms and soothe her instantly. I trusted that if something went wrong, he would be there for her. But work comes first, I reminded myself. I had prepared myself for the exhaustion of taking care of her alone. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. The next day, everything changed. I received the call from the preschool and rushed to the hospital. When I arrived, my heart sank. Saffron's small body was hooked up to tubes, lying unconscious on the hospital bed. I felt helpless. The preschool staff was just as shaken. They looked at me with a mix of sympathy and guilt. The director approached me, her expression grim. You're Saffron's aunt, right? Her mother's sisters? Yes, that's right, I replied, still in shock. We've been trying to reach your sister, but we haven't been able to get through. We even tried contacting her workplace, the director explained. I felt a wave of frustration and anger. My sister had abandoned her daughter for some trip abroad, leaving me to pick up the pieces. And now, Saffron was lying in a hospital bed, unresponsive, because of her neglect. I couldn't reach her either. No matter how many times I tried to call, she wouldn't answer. I stood there in silence, staring at my niece, feeling the weight of responsibility crush me. How could my sister be so careless? How could this have happened? They said she's on vacation. Where is your sister now? The director asked, her voice filled with concern. She's overseas, I replied, feeling my stomach tighten. The director's eyes widened in disbelief. So that's what happened, she murmured, her voice rising with frustration as she recounted the events of the day. She explained that when my niece arrived at the preschool, her face had been flushed, and during the daily temperature check, the sheet my sister was supposed to fill out at home had been left blank. The preschool has strict policies against admitting a child with a fever, and they immediately took Saffron's temperature. It was 35.8 degrees Celsius, too high, since they don't accept children with a temperature over 35.5 degrees Celsius. The director had insisted my sister take Saffron home, but my sister brushed them off, claiming that Saffron's temperature always ran high, and it wasn't an issue. She ignored their warnings and left Saffron at the preschool. After that, they tried calling her multiple times, but when they couldn't get through, they reached out to my parents. Unfortunately, my parents were at work and unavailable during the day. They had no backup plan, as my sister had only provided our parents as emergency contacts. In desperation, the teachers found an old contact number from over a year ago. That's when they called me. This should never have happened. The director's voice wavered, tears forming in her eyes as she looked at my niece lying helplessly in the hospital. I'm so sorry, I said, my own voice trembling. I'll get in touch with my sister. I apologized to the director and the staff, then sent them back to the preschool. As soon as they left, I dialed my sister's number over and over again, but all I got was a disconnected tone. Dozens, hundreds of calls. None of them were answered. Meanwhile, my parents rushed to the hospital after I informed them of the situation. My mother kept trying to reassure me, though it felt like she was convincing herself more than me. Saffron's going to be okay. We're in a hospital. She'll get better, she repeated, almost like a mantra. But the treatments weren't working. Her condition kept getting worse. I continued trying to reach my sister, but every attempt was in vain. 2 days later, Saffron's small, fragile life slipped away, never to recover. A 2-year-old child passed away without her mother by her side, without ever feeling the warmth of her mother's touch in her final moments. How could something so cruel happen? Tears streamed down my face as I gently touched Saffron's cold body. My mind was consumed with guilt. Why hadn't I asked more questions? Why didn't I demand to know where my sister was traveling? Why hadn't I stopped her from leaving? I couldn't stop blaming myself. It's not your fault, my mother whispered through her own tears, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder as I sobbed. But even her voice trembled with the weight of grief. I had tried repeatedly to contact my husband, desperate to let him know what had happened, but he too was unreachable. Time seemed to blur as we sank deeper into despair. In the end, we had to hold Saffron's funeral without any contact from my sister. It was a painful day, filled with sorrow and unanswered questions. The day of the funeral coincided with the day my sister was supposed to return from her trip. I clung to my phone throughout the ceremony, hoping, praying, she would call. And just as the dashiels were chanting, my phone buzzed in my hand. Hello? Thank you for taking care of Saffron. I just landed at the airport. I'm on my way back home. Do you want anything as a souvenirs? I stood there, stunned, her casual tone ringing in my ears. I clenched the phone tightly, my anger bubbling up. My voice shook, barely able to form words.
What?
I can't hear you, she said, sounding confused. You took her life. I screamed, unable to hold back any longer. The room fell silent as my voice echoed through the hall. Huh? What are you talking about? She asked, still completely unaware. Saffron. She's dead. I yelled, tears choking my voice. Do you even know how lonely she was? How scared she must have been. There was silence on the other end. Then her voice trembled. No, this isn't funny, right? Funny. I spat, incredulous. No one's laughing. Saffron is gone. I couldn't hold back my emotions any longer. The grief, the anger, the heartbreak, it all came pouring out and I took several deep breaths, trying to calm myself. My emotions were all over the place, but I knew I had to keep it together. I'm at Saffron's funeral, I said through clenched teeth. Get here as soon as you can. Without waiting for her reply, I hung up the phone. I apologize for the interruption, I said to the dashiell, feeling guilty for causing a scene. But he just placed a gentle hand on my head, offering comfort. As the funeral drew to a close, and we were getting ready to head to the crematorium, my sister finally arrived, out of breath. And behind her, to my shock, was my husband. No, this can't be happening, I thought. My sister collapsed next to Saffron's body, crying uncontrollably. Why, she sobbed, but her tears meant nothing to me. My husband stood awkwardly behind her, silent and motionless. The relatives who were present watched her with cold, distant expressions, though no one openly criticized her. Maybe it was out of respect for Saffron, but I felt their judgment in the air. I stayed quiet. I refused to speak to either of them, my sister or my husband, until after the cremation. As we sat in silence, waiting for it to be over, I thought of one thing. Saffron had been waiting for her mother. She died waiting for her. After the cremation, we went back to my parents' house. My sister was immediately confronted by our parents, who unleashed their fury on her. I remained silent, watching the scene unfold, until something caught my eye, her carry-on suitcase. That's when it hit me. Why were they at the same place? Why did they arrive at the same time? I stared at the suitcase, noticing the airport tag still attached to the handle. Both of them had just returned from the same airport. My heart sank. I turned to my sister, who quickly closed her mouth, refusing to speak. Then, my husband finally broke the silence. I'm sorry, he stammered. It's not what it looks like. Is this true? I demanded, looking at my sister for answers. Is it? But she just stood there, offering no explanation. This isn't the time for that, she muttered, avoiding my eyes. Saffron should have been your first priority, I shouted, my voice shaking with fury. I was so close to losing control, my hands balled into fists at my sides. But it wasn't their affair that enraged me the most. It was their negligence, their utter disregard for my niece. I couldn't stop myself. Stop crying, I screamed at my sister. You have no right to those tears. Do you know how many times I called you? How hard is it to think that something could have happened to your own daughter? While the two of you were off indulging in your disgusting affair, Saffron was suffering. She died alone because of you. They both stood there, stunned, as I let my anger pour out. You'll never be forgiven for this. Never. I hope you both rot in hell for what you've done. I'm sorry, my sister whispered, barely able to look at me. You think saying sorry is enough? I yelled back. You think this is your penance? You ignored every call, left Saffron to die, and now you think a few words will make it right? You're as guilty as he is. My parents didn't stop me. In fact, they backed me up. You're no longer our daughter, my father said, his voice filled with disgust. Don't you dare show your face here again. I can never forgive you. Why is everyone blaming me? My sister cried, her voice desperate. I don't care about you anymore. She stormed out of the house, leaving behind Saffron's remains, not even taking her daughter's ashes. My husband? He stood in silence, guilt written all over his face. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He simply nodded, knowing he had no right to say anything. We agreed to settle everything quickly. He gave me all the shared assets, and the alimony was paid in full. We divorced not long after. You think this is atonement for what you did? I said to him during our final meeting. You'll never be rid of your sins. In the months that followed, both my sister and my ex-husband faced charges. The preschool director had filed a case for child neglect and abuse. My sister tried to defend herself, hiring a court-appointed attorney, but no one was on her side. Not even our parents. The court sessions were brutal. My parents and I testified truthfully, recounting the events leading up to Saffron's death. In the end, my sister was sentenced to 5 years in prison, while my ex-husband received 2 years. He knew Saffron had been left at the preschool with a fever, and yet he did nothing. 5 years and 2 years. How can 7 years combined ever compensate for a child's life? It left me feeling hollow, empty. Even after all these years, I still feel that what they received wasn't enough. The guilt they carry, the years behind bars, they'll never be enough to erase the pain of losing Saffron. Their lives were destroyed, and rightly so, but it's not enough. 6 years have passed since that dark chapter of my life. I've remarried, and I now have a child of my own. My little one has been my source of healing. I'll never forget Saffron, but my own child has given me the strength to move forward. I promised myself I would be the kind of mother Saffron never had. Always there, always caring. People say that sin never fades, that it stays with you forever. And I know that's true. My sister and my ex-husband will carry their burden for the rest of their lives, but even that feels too light for the life they took. Human life is precious, and nothing can ever make up for the one they let slip away.